And the meeting's live.
Wonderful. Good morning. As we begin our meeting, we respectfully acknowledge that our meeting today is taking place on occupied Coast Salish land. We pay respect to Coast Salish elders past and present and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize the history of physical and cultural genocide and settler colonialism, which continues to displace Indigenous people today. It is also to recognize these lands, these waters, and their significance for the resilient and wise people who continue to thrive in the region despite the consequences of displacement and broken treaties. Those who hold settler privilege in this city must work towards supporting the Coast Salish people and all Indigenous people using the various forms and wealth and privilege they reap due to it. All right, with that, I call the March 28th Planning Commission meeting to order. Welcome to all. Couple of announcements to members of the public and visitors. Welcome. We're happy to make all commission meetings open to the public. Please note, though, that the Planning Commission does not hold public hearings since the commission is an advisory body. We provide recommendations to elected leaders that in turn make the actual decisions. We encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. Also, obviously, this meeting is a hybrid meeting with some individuals participating remotely, while others are participating in person in the Boards and Commissions room at Seattle City Hall. I am going to ask Olivia to pull up the Color Brave space norms. And I need to switch screens so I can see them myself and see commissioners. I did not line someone up in advance. Okay. And so I'm not going to call on Matt, but let's see who we have. Deanna, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask you to pull out one that feels relevant to you and speak to the significance of it to today's conversation.
I will center collective Indigenous and Black expertise, norms, and joy at racial intersections of gender, class, and disability. Just to help us center our discussion today on the draft that's been the effort of the last few weeks of the commission to really ensure we are able to provide an equitable and racially centered comprehensive plan for the future of our city.
Wonderful. I thank you so much for doing that on the fly. If there are no other amendments to the Color Brave space norms, I suggest that we all agree to these. All right, on the agenda today, we have two agenda items related to the Commission's review and comment of the One Seattle Comprehensive on the draft, One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. First, Planning Commission staff will present a staff draft outline of the Comprehensive Plan draft environmental impact statement, comment letter. Second, staff will provide a staff draft outline of the Commission's comment letter on the comprehensive plan itself. Are there any other amendments, staff, to that agenda plan? I know things were slightly in flux yesterday evening. Is that still the approach?
Yes, thanks, Michaela. That's still the approach. I do have one public comment to read when we get to that point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. If I haven't, did I skip? No, I did not skip public comment. Okay, so public comment is coming. We're first going to approve the meeting minutes from the March 14th, 2024 Planning Commission meeting. May I get a motion to approve?
Rick moves.
David will second.
Wonderful. Does anybody have any changes or amendments? With that, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed? Any abstentions? And with that, our meeting minutes are passed and we are warmed up and ready for the agenda today. The chair's report, a note about upcoming planning commission meetings. We have our regular cadence of committee meetings plus full commission meetings, but we are using all of these meetings to make progress on review of the plan together as a group. So the next Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting is next Thursday, April 2nd from 7:30 to 9 a.m. That meeting will be held online using the MS Teams platform. And then our next full commission meeting is scheduled for Thursday, April 9th from 3 to 5:30 p.m. That meeting will be hybrid with options for both in person in the boards and commissions room at Seattle City Hall, as well as the online MS Teams platform. With that, I will hand it over to Vanessa for some announcements and commission business.
Great. Thank you, Michaela. My apologies, there was a typo in your chair's notes. The Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting is next Thursday, April 4th. Hard to believe that Monday is, that was our fault. So not you, I just wanted to make that clear. And it's hard to believe that Monday is April 1st. So the Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting is next Thursday, April 4th. As noted before, this is a hybrid meeting. Commission staff is here in the boards and commissions room of City Hall. All commissioners are joining the call remotely. We do not have any members of the public present, but as I noted before, we do have one public comment that I will read after the introductions. Please use the chat function of Teams to be recognized to speak. Please do not put substantive comment in the chat, as members of the public listening in do not have access to that. As I mentioned, after introductions, I will read the public comment. And with that, I'll ask Michaela to start the introductions. And as part of the introductions, please indicate your day job and, if desired, any disclosure regarding your forthcoming comments during this meeting that do not represent your employer. Just if you want to take that opportunity to make it clear that your opinions are your own and not of your employer, please do so. And after introducing yourself, please call on a fellow commissioner to introduce themselves. We'll wrap up with staff, and if you need our help identifying somebody who has not yet been called on, just ask. So go ahead, Michaela.
All right, good morning, Michaela Daffrin, she, her pronouns. I live in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and I work for the King County Department of Community and Human Services. And I, in my day job, manage a team that's reviewing and commenting on draft comprehensive plans for jurisdictions around King County. I've recused myself on that end of my job from all review of Seattle's plan so that I can fully participate in the Commission's review. And any comments I make today are certainly not at all the opinions of my employer. With that, I will call on my co-chair, David Goldberg.
Good morning. I'm David Goldberg, he, him pronouns. I'm a resident of the Wallingford Urban Village and work for the Washington State Department of Transportation. And I will call on Matt.
Let's see, my name is Matt Hutchins. I use he, him pronouns. I am an architect. I live in West Seattle. Let's see, how about Rose?
Morning, I'm Rose Lucella-Whitson. My pronouns are they, them. I live up north in Licton Springs, and I work as a professional wetland scientist and environmental permitting specialist for Jacobs Engineering. Nothing I say is the view of my company. Everything I say is my own. And with that, I pass it to Andy.
Andy Dannenberg, he, him pronouns, Northeast Seattle, and I work at the University of Washington, teach in public health and in urban planning. I can't see who hasn't gone yet.
How about Nick?
Good morning, Nick Whipple. I live in West Seattle in the North Del Ridge neighborhood, and for my day job, I work as a city planner over in Bellevue. Deanna?
Good morning, Diana Quintanar. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill. And for my day job, I am a multimodal transportation planner at WSP, and views are my own for all comments I share today, not of those of my employer. And Vanessa or others, if you could help us identify who hasn't gone.
Sure. How about Jamie?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jamie Strobel. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in the future 130th station area. And I work for as the Director of Climate Action and Resilience for the Nature Conservancy of Washington. And then today my views are my own and not my employer. And then I also, outside of my day job, was a part of supporting one of the community organizations that that was funded to do outreach for the comp plan. So.
Thanks, Jamie. How about Rick?
Morning all, I'm Rick Moeller. I use he, him pronouns. I live just north of the Wallingford Urban Village in what may become the Tangletown Neighborhood Center. In my day job, I'm an architect. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington. And like others, my views are my own, and I will call on Zio.
Morning all, Theo Alvarez, he, they pronouns. I live in White Center, Highland Park, and I'm a designer at Element Architects, which is a private architecture firm downtown. All of my views are my own. I think Caleb hasn't gone.
That's right.
Good morning. My name is Caleb Toolday, he, him pronouns. I live in the Central District and I work at Rainier Scholars doing leadership development work with our middle and high school scholars. With that, I will pass it on to staff.
Thanks, Caleb. Robin?
Robin McGonigal out here on Vashon Island. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm staff to the commission. Olivia.
Yeah.
Morning, everyone. Olivia Baker. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also staff to the Planning Commission. John?
Good morning. I'm John Hoy, staff to the Planning Commission. I use he, him pronouns.
And good morning, everyone. My name is Vanessa Murdoch. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Planning Commission, and thank you all for being here. And I will punt it back to Michaela and then read the public comment.
All right, well, we as the Planning Commission provide time for public comment at all of our meetings. A reminder for anyone listening in that we do not hold public hearings as we are an advisory body. We make recommendations to elected leaders who in turn make the actual decisions. Individuals who make comments to the commission should remember that the mayor and the city council make the decisions, especially on this comprehensive plan. We encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. And I will at this time invite Vanessa to read what public comment we've received into the record.
Thank you, Michaela. I will now start the public comment. I'm a Capitol Hill resident and Midwestern transplant. I left everything I knew behind to be part of an accepting environment. While I found a great queer community, the monumental cost of living was sobering. Many in my neighborhood, from doctors to service workers, faced economic displacement at the hands of increasing rents. Each departure slowly broke apart the queer community I traveled so far to experience. The recent failure of helpful state legislation such as rent stabilization, TOD, and housing accountability further underscore the importance of an innovative comp plan. The 2021 Burke Housing Needs Analysis employed two growth scenarios. The higher growth scenario proposed approximately 6,000 new units per year. Alternative 5 of the One Seattle Plan aligns with this high growth scenario. Burke's Housing Needs high growth projection identified a 34,000 units shortage for households making 80% AMI or less by 2045, worsening the 2020 shortage of 21,000 units for similar household income bands. Even the highest growth recommendations worsen surrender day conditions for Seattleites. The draft 1 Seattle plan is a massive disappointment. The city needs to implement Alternative 6, which the community resoundingly supported in previous engagement. The city ignored public feedback when crafting their draft and now needs to acknowledge said feedback in open houses, online, and elsewhere to provide accountability. The housing element needs to meet the demands of the missing middle housing bill, not only meet but exceed the Commerce recommendation for 1.2 FAR to free up development capacity across all neighborhoods and reestablish high-growth centers in future mass transit areas such as West Seattle and 145th. We need land use, bulking, and parking policies which free up land across all neighborhoods for innovative housing such as point access blocks and stacked flats. We need a transportation element which takes seriously the failures and fatalities of Vision Zero. From 2020 to 2022, we averaged 17 pedestrian deaths per year. We need bold commissioners willing to serve as a guide rail for future resident equity and safety. Without your visionary comment letter, the future of Seattle will only become more hostile to residents, both old and new. Nico Faz. That concludes the public comment received.
Right. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for reading that in. This takes us to our first main agenda item, which is discussion of the Draft 1 Seattle Comprehensive Plan Draft Environmental Impact Statement, Seattle Planning Commission Staff Proposed Comment Letter Outline. That is going to be one very long title for the way this will work is we have 35 minutes for this agenda item. Planning Commission staff will present us with a draft outline on the Commission's comment letter on the DEIS, and then we will have an opportunity for comments and discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to John and Olivia, I think.
I'm going to start.
Okay.
Olivia and I are going to ping pong back and forth just to keep you all awake.
Can you recognize Jim is in the audience?
Oh, sure.
He is. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I'll just say that Olivia and I are going to provide an overview of the staff draft outline of the comprehensive plan draft environmental impact statement comment letter. Olivia forwarded on the draft outline to you all earlier this week. She and I and Vanessa have been reviewing the draft EIS, and we will provide you our initial takeaways on it and provide you an overview, and we will allow room for discussion. On that, we'll also allow room for review. We're going to give you 5 minutes after we provide our initial presentation. We'll give you 5 minutes to review that before we go into discussion. We also invited Jim Holmes from OPCD to linger in the background in case there are any questions that Olivia, Vanessa, and I cannot answer. So thank you, Jim, for joining us. So I'll just go through a few slides just to give you an overview. First slide here, the purpose of this review is staff decided to take on the review of the draft environmental impact statement. So we did an initial review of selected sections. The document is very long, very detailed, as those of you who have looked at environmental impact statements in the past know. We will be offering our initial observations. We will raise questions for clarification. Staff has prepared an initial outline of our comments, and then the next steps will be after today's discussion will be to flesh out that outline and provide a draft comment letter, and then that comment letter will be on the same track as the main comment letter for the comprehensive plan comment letter, and is on schedule to be reviewed and then approved about a month from now. So next slide, please. So just again, just a reminder of what the intent of a draft environmental impact statement is for the comprehensive plan. As you probably know, an environmental impact statement is intended to be an informational document, in this case that supplements a planning document. The DEIS describes existing conditions in the city. It describes proposed actions and alternatives. In this case, new policies and growth strategies. It documents any potential adverse environmental impacts that may occur. It also identifies mitigation measures to reduce or eliminate those adverse impacts. And it identifies any potential significant, unavoidable, or adverse impacts. I'm just going to read this this is actually from the OPCD website. They produced a really handy story map that you may also want to review that summarizes the DEIS. And in this case, they say that the EIS alternatives represent different growth strategies. The alternative should represent a diverse range of options that can highlight the impacts of different potential choices. The alternative should be broad enough that the final preferred alternative, which is included in the final plan, will fall within the range of the alternatives studied. So next slide, please. So the draft EIS did review and study 5 different alternatives. Those came from the final scoping report. So each alternative is studied and documented within the DEIS and within many different topics, and many of these are required for all environmental impact statements. The long list is there on the screen. Staff primarily reviewed the ones that are highlighted. We reviewed air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. Olivia will speak to that. I reviewed the land use and urban form. I'll give you a summary of that. Olivia will talk to population, housing, and employment. And then I will bounce back and talk about transportation. Just a high-level summary of what we saw, and then we'll go into the review of the draft outline. Olivia.
Yeah, thanks, John. So as John mentioned, we're just going to just give you a bit of information about what was covered in these key topics within the draft environmental impact statement, just to give you a sense of what we've read. So under air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's one of the key takeaways is that the DEIS found no significant unavoidable adverse impacts. And also they did a lot of comparisons across alternatives of greenhouse gas emissions citywide. Their study included both transportation emissions and building emissions, so it was pretty wide ranging. And it said essentially that alternative 1 which was the no action alternative, so if we left everything as is, would have the highest emissions per capita, with alternative 5 being the most intensive form of development, having the lowest emissions per capita. It studied both impacts to air quality from construction and from transportation. Looking at construction, the study noted for this group to note that there was a specific study of impacts to sensitive uses such as residential uses and daycares and schools near highways. And so they studied specifically air quality impacts near I-5 and of course that's in the city. So you'll see in the outline that I spoke a bit about that study. And then they also covered a sort of a list of potential mitigation measures to deal with those air quality impacts, and that covered everything from promoting more sustainable transportation and using more dense land use mixtures to improving tree canopy and different zoning and development standards that could address proximity to pollution sources or things like enhanced filtration for sensitive uses. So there's a pretty robust mitigation measures list in that section. I'll pass it back to you, John.
Okay. So I'm going to provide an overview of the chapter on land use patterns and urban form. The highest level takeaway from this chapter is the EIS states that there are no significant unavoidable adverse impacts to land use patterns, compatibility, or urban form expected under any of the alternatives. That is their high-level summary statement. Specifically, as you dive down into the impacts, there are a variety of impacts documented in the chapter, starting with increased frequency of areas with mixing of uses and heights as the areas grow. There will be localized adverse compatibility issues as the existing lower intensity uses transition to higher intensity development forms in the various alternatives. The intensity of land use patterns would shift most dramatically under alternative 5, which has the highest level of development activity. As those levels increase over time, building heights, bulk, and/or scale in the new place types would likely increase with new development. So those are mostly land use compatibility and bulk and mass and scale and transitions impacts. The mitigation measures that are proposed to manage those impacts state ultimately that all of the impacts are likely temporary and will be resolved over time or reduced by the application of existing or new development regulations and design standards, and that the gradual conversion of the lower intensity uses to higher intensity development patterns is unavoidable, but it's an expected characteristic of urban population and employment growth. Next to Olivia.
And the next section we focused in on was population, housing, and employment. Something I'll highlight about this section is that there was a really detailed historical context section at the start, which looked into the past harms that were racially motivated and that led to a lot of discrimination and exclusion within the housing system. And I'll talk about that in a bit more depth in a later slide because some commissioners requested that we talk about the harms that were detailed. But looking at this section more broadly, it studied impacts to housing and to jobs of the comprehensive plan. Under the housing section, it studied a pretty wide swath of topics from housing supply, diversity of housing types that could be provided under each alternative, impacts to affordability, and impacts to potential displacement. And I should note that in the displacement, they looked specifically at physical displacement, economic displacement, and cultural displacement. They broke out their study into those 3 different categories. Under jobs, I would say that the analysis is pretty light, but the takeaway really is that the majority of job growth expected under the plan will continue to occur in urban centers, specifically the regional centers. And only about 5% of job growth would be expected in the neighborhood centers and/or corridors, depending on which alternative they were looking at the time. The mitigation measures were largely surrounding housing, and it suggested a pretty wide variety of things to improve affordability and to prevent displacement. The suggestions ranged from implementing mandatory housing affordability in neighborhood residential zones to increase affordability, increasing funding for anti-displacement programs, strengthening relocation assistance programs, and considering density bonuses for income restricted projects. And there were others in there as well. And let's see what's next. Back to you, John.
Okay, and I'm going to cover the transportation chapter. The transportation chapter was, I think, the longest in the whole document. It's a very technical chapter, a lot of detailed analysis. I'm going to just provide you with the high-level takeaways. The impacts discussion, the high-level summary is that all of the action alternatives, anything other than the no action alternative, are expected to result in higher vehicle miles traveled than the no action alternative due to the increased growth levels within all of the alternatives. All of the action alternatives are expected to have significant impacts to several categories. One, transit passenger load, corridor travel time, then the intersection level of service, specifically in the Northeast 130th and Northeast 145th Street subarea, and state facilities. And there they mean I-5 and 99, those corridors. The DEIS states that the impacts of alternative 5 are expected to be higher in magnitude from a transportation perspective due to the increased growth citywide. It is possible that the action alternatives, and alternative 5 in particular, could result in additional vehicle emissions near underserved communities along high vehicle emissions roadways. That's similar to the impacts that Olivia discussed in the air quality section. This is a part of the equity discussion that is included in each of the chapters. This was one of the high-level callouts in the equity section of the transportation chapter. As for mitigation measures, they have a wide variety of mitigation measures proposed. The city is expected to pursue targeted transportation capacity improvements focused on improved transit, bicycle, pedestrian, and freight connections. The city will also propose to manage demand, transportation demand, using policies, programs, and investments aimed at shifting travel to non-single occupant vehicle modes. And then the ultimate bottom line that the chapter states that all of those are mitigatable, all of the impacts, except for a significant unavoidable adverse impact to transit capacity is expected under all alternatives. That's it.
All right. So we also wanted to include a slide that would kind of provide information about where we can find more details on a lot of topics that the commission has brought up in the past throughout this conversation. The slide's really just sort of an FYI. I know there's a lot of text and numbers here. It's more of a reference that we can look back to if there's any topic that you wanted to look into more specifically. I think it's just important to keep in mind here that we sort of have two goals with the DEIS. Today we're talking about staff outline on the DEIS comment letter, which will be talking about, sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the analysis itself. But of course, the DEIS is also a very helpful tool for reviewing and understanding the comprehensive plan draft. And so this slide is really just sort of leaning in that latter direction of elements of the DEIS that could be helpful in the group's understanding of the draft comprehensive plan. So I can always come back to this if you have questions, but again, this is just sort of a reference that can be helpful if you want to dive into any details on a topic. And then as mentioned, we wanted to give a quick overview of some of the past harms that were discussed in the DEIS as was requested. And so I will say that I believe both the housing section and the land use section, it was unique to those two sections of the DEIS, had, I would call them more of like a narrative description of historical context and historical harms that were related specifically to housing and land use that have sort of led to the patterns that we see in the housing market today, and sort of the legacy of these past practices and how they have a disparate impact, particularly for people of color in today's housing market. And so this is just kind of hits the highlights of what was covered in there, but if you want to know more, I recommend you read it. It's about 3 pages in the housing section. I imagine it's similar in the land use section. And it covers everything from you know, early displacement of Native peoples living in what is now Seattle area by white European settlers all the way back in the 1840s. It covers exclusion and forced relocation of Chinese people during the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s, and then forced incarceration of Japanese people and Japanese Americans in World War II. And then it also talks about, you know, physical changes to the land that led to displacement and disruption of natural systems like the Ship Canal building and Ballard Locks, as well as the construction of I-5 through downtown. And then it goes into, you know, more of the late 1900s, or I suppose all of the 1900s, actions like housing exclusion and, you know, explicit discrimination that was used, how zoning was used as a tool to segregate, how there were racially restrictive covenants that had explicit language, you know, barring, for example, Black people from living in certain communities within the city. Talks about redlining and how discrimination in the sale or rental of housing was legal until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And so it kind of culminates that whole narrative section with connections to how this legacy of past practices in Seattle has led to, you know, discrimination and disparities in, I suppose, like housing cost burden for people of color, home ownership discrepancies, and like discrepancies in wealth and intergenerational wealth building. So it ties all of that together into how, you know, you see the reflection of that in today's housing market. So happy to talk more about this if folks have questions, but wanted to kind of give you an overview because we do specifically call out in the draft outline how we, you know, John and I noted that this was a positive. We thought of the DEIS that they did such a thorough job including this in the analysis. So with that, I guess we will move to talking about the outline itself. I think what our plan is here is I'll just run through this high-level outline really quickly, and then we'll give you all a 5-minute review so you can read the outline yourself if you haven't had the chance to do so, and then we can jump into a discussion about everything that we've talked about so far. So I will email the outline out to you all right before the 5-minute review, just in case you can't find it in your inboxes. It was sent out originally on Tuesday. And this outline follows pretty similarly to past draft environmental impact statement comment letters that this group has made in the past. So we start off with a section that's sort of a high level praise for aspects of the DEIS that we appreciated, and then it moves into discussion of areas for additional analysis. And so within that, there's some high level overall recommendations for some changes to the analysis that cover the entire DEIS, and then there are some section specific recommendations that we've included. So as you can see here, we covered the 4 topics that John and I just spoke to, but there's certainly room for diving into some of the other sections. We're talking about other topics that are of interest to the group. So I will just say, as you're reading through the outline and as we're having a discussion, today would be an excellent time to raise questions that you have for staff that about what might be in the DEIS that we didn't talk about today, or things that you hope are in there but you haven't heard us mention, or questions about anything that we talked about. The next time this group all gets together to talk about the draft outline, or sorry, the draft comment letter for the DEIS, we will have sort of a full staff draft, and there will only be really one more meeting to discuss it. So today's a great time to sort of dig up questions that you might have and ask some of those like broader questions and make broad recommendations so that we have time to research them for you. So with that, I will go ahead and hit send on this email. So the draft is in the top of your inbox. And unless there are any burning questions before we get started, we can move into the 5-minute review time. Okay, that was about 5 minutes, so hopefully folks had a chance to take a look at the draft. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up on the screen as well so we can run through it as folks have questions, but I'll pass it back to you, Michaela, to sort of facilitate this question and discussion time.
Okay, I appreciated that 5-minute overview. If folks are like me, I've had a busy week and kind of coming into this feeling very appreciative of having Seattle Planning Commission staff who've done some really hard work to pull together a really thoughtful outline. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed with all of the information and possibilities. And I imagine you are as well. So if folks want to start putting their names in the chat box, if you have questions for staff or comments, I'm going to, I see Jamie actually is first out of the gate today with questions. So Jamie, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on just a minute. I forgot about the fact that we had a new commissioner join us during the staff briefing. Radhika, would you take a moment to introduce yourself and do any disclosures necessary?
Hi everyone, I'm Radhika Nair. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Wedgwood and I'm an urban planner.
And is there any disclosures related to the draft environmental impact statement?
My company works on some projects, but not directly on this one.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Jamie, please go ahead.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to point out that in the chat that OPCD released the anti-displacement framework as well as the appendices related to that. That was supposed to accompany the comp plan, and it just came out a couple of days ago. And so I'm assuming, Olivia, that you probably haven't had a chance to kind of crosswalk that, but I'm curious if you see any connections, opportunities, or if you've had a chance to kind of crosswalk it at all.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I actually just found it last night. So I have not read it yet, other than just to skim through. I did note in the chat, the appendix has a really handy overview of all the displacement related policies in the plan, which I know I'll be looking at again, because it goes across all the elements, not just what might be in housing or in economic development. So that's a handy resource, but I definitely plan to dive in more later today, and I expect I might have some more thoughts to share at the next commission meeting where we'll be talking about the housing elements specifically.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, Nick.
Thank you. And I agree with Michaela's statement. I also appreciate the staff spending the time going through this. I did not have a chance to go through the outline before today, so or the EIS, obviously. So I have a couple just questions, Olivia and John, if you were able to help me understand if these things were included as part of the EIS. Do we know, does the transportation analysis presume 100% build out, or do we understand kind of the methodology they were using to assess kind of what those impacts were? That's kind of the first question I had. And then the other one was around affordable housing. I'm curious, as they're looking at these density increases, if there was any economic analysis that's included as part of the affordable housing discussion. Curious if the EIS is analyzing kind of MHA at all, adjustments or other approaches to meet some of the affordable housing needs as capacity increases, both for commercial and residential, if that was included as an appendix or any reference kind of in the EIS on that.
Jim. I can
Okay.
I can take a first shot.
Yep.
Nick, thanks for your question on transportation specifically. So as I mentioned, the transportation chapter is very long, very detailed. They do it repeats for each alternative the results of all of the various analyses that were used, and they used a number of different impact methodologies, and it does get into vehicle miles traveled, daily person trips by mode, transit capacity. So each of so when you ask about full build out, each alternative talks about the various transportation impacts according to the build out that is described in that alternative. So obviously alternative 1 being the lowest build out, the no action, and then the 2, 3, 4, and 5. So there would be various degrees of build out that would impact the transportation network. And then as I described in my overview, alternative 5 is called out as the most significant for various transportation modes, but then ultimately the only impact that they say is unmitigatable is transit capacity, and that would be just because of the full build out of growth, and transit would be overwhelmed. So. And I brought that up in the outline as a question. What does that mean, and how do they plan on addressing that?
Okay, because in my understanding that EIS obviously just discloses those impacts. It doesn't have to necessarily kind of provide solutions for everything, but presuming 100% build out to me seems rather conservative. So I'm just curious, I guess, if that was the part of the methodology. Yeah, thanks.
So, Jim Holmes, Senior Planner, OPCD. Nick, tell me what you mean by 100% build out. You mean?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Complete zoning capacity maximized on every lot?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so we only look forward at growth covering the next 20 years. We have never, just because that 100% build out is some far off distant thing that probably never occurs, and we will adjust zoning and our planning policies every 10 years as we go forward. But we do look ahead 20 years. So we look at, we're assuming the 100,000 dwelling units in 3 of the action alternatives, and that those were used to generate traffic impacts.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Jim.
And Jim, is it safe to say, I believe I read at one point that in an effort to coordinate with SDOT and their work on the STP, that the Comprehensive Plan DEIS treated transportation as though it wasn't changing, essentially, like they held transportation steady and didn't factor in all of the changes that the STP was considering. So this analysis is based on our transportation system as it is today. Is that correct?
Well, we looked at the impact of the growth. We have been coordinating with SDOT on STP and comp plan related issues pretty much throughout this process. But to answer that specific question, I'm going to have to find out and get back to you on that.
Okay. Nick, to respond to the housing side of your question, the DEIS definitely analyzes affordability in the housing section. So it looks at, cost across alternatives to, rent the average apartment in each of the analysis zones. I should note we didn't mention that they broke the city down into, I believe, 8 analysis zones to do sort of more of a fine-grained look at the city. So a lot of the studies were broken down into, how it would impact each of the sections within the city. And so it talked about, affordability of rent across alternatives. It talked about potential affordability of home ownership of different types of units across the alternatives. But I would say that there wasn't an economic analysis about like the feasibility of producing any of those units under the plan, or what potentially like the cost of new units produced under different alternatives might be. It was really looking at the current affordability in today's market. So I don't think there was as much of like forward projection of affordability. It talks mostly about existing conditions related to that. There was an analysis of MHA and projected future, mandatory housing affordability and the number of future units that could be produced under that. It specifically looks at the number of units that would be produced if the mandatory housing affordability wasn't expanded, if the program remained as it was today. And talks about the difference between, if we sort of keep it in the zones that it is today versus if it was expanded into new zones such as neighborhood residential. And I will note that that was one of the potential mitigation measures that was listed in the DEIS is considering expanding MHA. I get those acronyms out today. Does that cover everything you're asking?
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, and then curious, I guess, if it would be included in the outline, some of that information, but we can, that's maybe just a comment. Thanks.
Okay.
Matt.
Excuse me. Let's see. I've got 2 points. One is that because of state law under HB 1110, all the alternatives should include modeling for 4plexes and 6plexes as a baseline, not as a component of some strategies. So therefore, I kind of think that the impacts have been maybe isolated to study those in the neighborhood, in the neighborhood residential zones. However, it's really a component of impacts for every alternative. So I want to make sure that that is included. And then the second thing, I'm still not getting the sort of disconnect between the amount of affordable housing that we say that we need and the overall housing production that we think this is going that's going to occur under HB 1220. We're supposed to be solving for affordability in all these income bands. There's an excellent graph in Exhibit 3.7-4 that talks about how much affordable housing we needed at the various income bands. And when you total that up over the 20-year horizon, it's about 61,000. And our base model is really only planning for 80,000 units altogether. So are we really going to produce 3-to-1 affordable housing units or some sort of from 0 to 80% AMI units in the city? I just don't see how that is going to occur. So I'd like a tighter correlation between how these alternatives solve for affordable housing.
Thank you, Matt. Andy.
3 items, 2 should be fairly quick. One is the wording that transit load is an adverse impact. I mean, there's a positive side to that if transit load goes up, it creates more demand and potentially helps support creating more transit. So I don't know if you can play with the wording so it's not necessarily, it's adverse short term, but long term increased load means increased demand may mean increased transit. So I don't know if you want to, any comment on that?
I'll just respond that I called that out because that is identified as a significant unavoidable adverse impact. And they're saying that transit capacity would be exceeded.
Right.
So that's basically saying that they don't imagine, my interpretation is with the existing transit network that they can't handle the anticipated growth.
Right.
It doesn't talk. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but they don't get in. It just states it as a significant unavoidable adverse impact.
Okay, but whether we can say, hey, there is a plus side to that is what I'm not sure if that's appropriate. The second one is there's a sentence about high traffic areas being near vulnerable populations and mentions daycare, schools, and housing. Daycare and schools are basically single places that if they're near a busy road, potentially could go elsewhere, whereby the housing needs a lot of land and is much harder to move in quantity. So I'm wondering if that could be worded in a way that calls out it's affordable housing in particular that needs a lot of land that is particularly high risk, whereby some of these other ones, such as daycare and school, are a little bit easier to move away from pollution because they need less land. So it's just trying to separate out the housing from all vulnerable uses. And that's a wording thing if you agree or not. Any comment on that?
I think that's something we can definitely accommodate. I don't, unless there's thoughts by other commissions, I don't see why I couldn't make that note.
Okay. And the third one is I did not hear and did not see on that list, but it could be there, is anything about earthquake preparedness and resilience. I saw some things on sea level rise and so forth, but if we have, the big one comes and we're not well prepared, a lot of the rest of this becomes almost irrelevant. And whether it's appropriate to put somewhere in the response a request for, more about earthquake preparedness and response and resilience.
That's a good question. John, did you see that?
No, maybe we can ask Jim about that. That's not something that I reviewed. It's not in the sections that I saw.
Yeah, so in the section on earth and water quality, we talk about flooding, sea level rise, and landslides.
Right.
I am not clear that we have addressed seismic safety. I will have to take a look and get back to you. I'm sorry. I'm new to the EIS beat, so that's the reason I'm learning as we go. But Andy, I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, good. And if it's not there, then that could be a comment in our response saying that it could or should be there. Thank you.
Just a quick reaction to the easy to move schools comment. I actually don't know if it's that easy to move schools because, like affordable housing, they require a lot of land and they're owned by an institution that holds that property for a really long time. Daycare's business model can fit into much smaller spaces within mixed use buildings, but just the schools piece, I think, presents a similar challenge. I've observed some of the conversations to try and cite school facilities across King County, and it's no easy feat. Yeah. Okay. Who's next? Let me find my list. I think it's Rick.
Thanks, Michaela. I have a couple of comments, and these are all, I think, related to the land use patterns and urban form section. First bullet point, land use impacts analysis emphasizes potential negative impacts of increased frequency of areas with mixing uses of heights, different land use types locating close to one another, and land use patterns that contain mixes of land uses with differing levels of intensity. This analysis is general across all the action alternatives and does not adequately describe the rationale for why these impacts are negative and what the consequences are. I also wanted to add, it contradicts in the draft plan LU 2.16, consider promoting varied building forms and heights to enhance attractive and walkable neighborhoods. Bullet point 3, language repeatedly describing negative impacts of height, bulk, scale, and transitions likely to be of concern to residents in existing low density neighborhoods. I think it might also be worth adding, as was pointed out in public comment, it contradicts the majority of comments in the community engagement process. And then I had two other quick comments similar to Andy's, and I recognize that there are limitations to the EIS process, and I've been frustrated by those in the past. But related to bulk and scale, there's already an issue related to bulk and scale because we have neighborhood residential zones in which there are lots of single-story houses, and when a new 3-story house goes in, there's a discontinuity in terms of bulk and scale. Or if a new house with 2 ADUs goes in, there's a discontinuity of bulk and scale. It's already in the code. It's already an issue. So I'm wondering why it's being raised as an issue here. And finally, and this is the one that's a bit more nuanced, there's a lot of rhetoric in the plan about the interest in creating walkable and complete communities. This, by definition, entails a mix of uses and in all likelihood entails a great variety and range of scale. So I'm wondering how that, similar to what Andy was saying about transit, yes, there's an issue in terms of bulk and scale, but there's also a tremendous benefit, which has already been claimed as a desire in the plan. So I'm wondering how those things get resolved.
Thanks, Rick.
Vanessa, do you want me to say anything?
Sure. I just wanted to acknowledge the comment.
Oh, I'll just say, Rick, I think the disconnect between the plan and the goals and policies in the plan and what they're documenting in the draft EIS is the draft EIS is talking about the potential adverse impacts and calling out, as you mentioned, calling out increasing bulk, mass, scale, and transitions. And that's why the comment in the outline is saying that it's that could be triggering for some people. It could be alarmist, but the reality is that the plan policies are calling for that. So I agree with your calling out as a contradiction. As someone that reviewed the draft EIS, the language was very kind of generic, and I've put that in the outline that the general language is just calls out those potential impacts, but it doesn't really describe the real life implications of evolution of neighborhoods or evolution of land use and evolution of these centers. So the plan is describing one thing and the EIS is making it sound like this is an impact.
I'd also like, this is Vanessa, I'd also like to add, sorry to Matt put in the chat to add to Rick's comment that the new neighborhood residential floor area ratio, FAR, is the same as the existing floor area ratio. So the scale is exactly the same. I just wanted to put that out to everybody. Sorry to cut off whoever I cut off.
So yeah, Jim Holmes, OVCD. I wanted to just offer some high-level EIS guidance on this. In an EIS, we are leaning into the impacts because we anticipate there will be an appeal, and we need to cite those impacts to cover our bases to avoid an appeal. So we might be identifying an impact of the plan. It might seem contradictory, but we're just simply saying some people might find that these are the impacts, and we are disclosing those to decision makers through the EIS, and that's just the purpose of the EIS.
I appreciate that, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
In the neighborhood residential zones, and I realize there are other zones that are included, but in neighborhood residential, as Matt pointed out, the bulk and scale is no different than what's allowed today. So how is that an impact?
Yeah, well, it does allow more units. It will allow taller dwelling units, but
No,
I hear
not in neighborhood residential.
Oh, okay. Anyway, I hear your point, and that would be a perfectly. That's the kind of comment that I expect we'll be hearing.
Okay, thanks. And John, my apologies. I meant to open my comments by saying thanks for the work on this, because I think overall it's very comprehensive and the points are really well made. So thanks.
There is so much to discuss here. I don't know if you all, like me, I think we could have a full meeting just kind of digging into the points that Rick just raised. So just wanted to call out the limitations of this format where we all sort of have to go in order and answer and ask our questions. Thank you very much, Rick. I am going to move us along on to Deanna.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No,
okay.
I thought we were going to move along. Then I was just going to mention the question. Yes, and I did note in a chat that Jim will graciously look into the population estimates. So appreciate that, Jim. I think I'm having just a hard time when I'm looking at the, just very quickly doing an overview of the information, the very comprehensive information in the DEIS, especially for transportation. There are a lot of analyses that are done per capita, right? And so I haven't found a single table that establish, what the population numbers or, kind of like all these VMT per capita and residents and like the per capita numbers, I like to understand if each alternative assumed the same amount of residents. And what today's what the baseline population is versus what the projected population is in 2044 to be able to get a sense of when these per capita numbers are being used, it's in relation to which population number. So if others know what, if folks have an understanding of this, it'd be helpful just to me to start making some quick sniff test of comparisons of the data that is being provided.
I can jump in just to maybe provide a little bit of helpful numbers here. I would say that in the population section of the DEIS, they are working on sort of a $37,000 people.
Sorry, the audio broke off.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think, are we back? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you start from the beginning?
Yeah. So I was saying in the population section, the DEIS is building off of a baseline using 2020 numbers for a citywide population of 737,000 approximately. And with the alternatives that they're studying, I'm not sure what the actual projection for population in 2044 will be, but they're using growth numbers. Of course, I only have the housing units in my head, not the people numbers. We'd have to translate that. But alternative one, no action. They're assuming, I believe, the baseline growth of 80,000 housing units. So I'd have to look at what they translate that to people. But then alternatives 2 through 4 are 100,000 housing units, and alternative 5 is 120,000 housing units. So the action alternatives are, only adding around 20,000 for 2 through 4 and 40,000 for alternative 5.
Does anybody know current household size in Seattle? Average household size?
I think in the projections they use somewhere between 1 and 2. It's like 1 point. No, maybe I don't remember. It's a pretty small average household size.
Yeah, I think it's just below 2.
There, thank you, Zia. Zia just dropped in the chat that it's
wow, that is
1.83.
That's extremely low. Okay. Okay.
And that's across all housing types. So that's single family and multifamily.
Right. Okay. So we're saying baseline is 730,000 residents. Unknown what is being assumed for the 2044 projections, and that's something that hopefully we can understand a little bit more. It's part of our.
Yes, I'll keep digging, and maybe Jim can help us if he can get that as well. So we'll look for that number.
Thank you.
Look into that.
If you're looking for another way to think about it, in table H4 in the countywide planning policies, they articulate Seattle's current housing unit count as of 2019, and then they articulate Seattle's net new housing needed by 2044. So if you're looking for what is it to like some comparison of what are the assumptions that we're operating with today versus where are we trying to go in the future, you can find it there in terms of housing units, just not people, Deanna. And then you could multiply that by 1.83. anyway, I'll let staff give you a clear answer.
Thank you.
Offline, yeah. Okay. Do we have any other folks with questions?
One last thing, sorry. Also, I see like they use total cars and total buses, and I am not seeing in an appendix or anywhere where I can reference what the total number of vehicles that are being assumed are either. But it could just be a matter of not just, having that table discreetly of like, generally assumptions used, population, vehicles by type, it's not very clear to me to kind of infer, right? If we're assuming the same number of vehicles as today, in the future, I'm assuming there's growth. So I'd like to understand what that assumption assumes, just to start thinking about whether this matches, if we know, or as we've had in some discussions, I'd be interested in thinking a little bit further about knowing that the majority of the growth in population might be for folks with larger incomes and AMI brackets. Are the assumptions consistent with what we anticipate car ownership and SOV travel to be in these projections? So that's why I'm looking into these numbers.
And we can look for that also, Deanna. And I can talk to Jim about that also.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I have a few questions since we have a few minutes. So I didn't expect, and I don't, like it's all new that we're documenting past discriminatory and exclusionary housing and land use practices. I didn't expect it to be in the draft environmental impact statement. I find that so I haven't read it, and I'm curious, because it's in there, are they also identifying mitigation measures similar to the other analyses in the DEIS?
I would say no, not perhaps in the way you're thinking. I mean, they do consider mitigation strategies for affordability, which is one of the outcomes that they cite of the harms, and for displacement, which is again one of the outcomes that they cite for the harms. So in that regard, yes, but I don't think there's any sort of explicit discussion of, addressing racially disparate impacts, aside from the fact that people of color are disproportionately impacted by housing and affordability and by displacement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
I'll just add briefly to that, Michaela. The land use section also. It sounds like this description of past history is in a couple different chapters in the EIS, and we've called that out. That we appreciate that. That narrative. It's more for introductory context. It's not really described as an impact, and so therefore it's not really described as mitigation. But within the land use chapter specifically, and as the other chapters also, there are equity discussions about how about the positive impacts, I would call them, for how these actions will result in positive outcomes for equity populations. So for example, in the outline, you'll see that I called out that they have a discussion of positive equity impacts related to increased density, including more equitable impacts to housing choice, a more varied urban form, more opportunity for vibrant neighborhoods, and opportunities for more multifamily housing. So it's addressing those past harms and saying these are opportunities that would have positive equity outcomes for those that have been affected. So it's not specifically called mitigation, but they're more like positive equity impacts of the actions.
I might suggest a recommendation of sorts that encourages the city to have a more nuanced take on where they're increasing housing choice, and particularly around sort of throughout the jurisdiction, because I just am not currently totally sold that the growth strategy that's in the plan is really opening up enough of our high opportunity areas in the city to households that have large families or households who have, who make below 80% of area median income. So helpful to know its context and not something where they do clear mitigation measures. We are at 8:55, so I'm going to, I guess I had the last word on this agenda item. I want to appreciate Jim for coming this morning. Thank you very much for clarifying things for us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And Vanessa, do you want to take it over for the next agenda item?
Certainly. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And I want to reiterate the thanks for Jim for being new to Team Draft DEIS and being willing to join us this morning and field the number of questions that he could. So we've got 4 minutes before the end of this meeting. I specifically indicated to Michaela that I wanted to spend as much time as needed, which of course we don't have as much time as we need, but at least in this morning's meeting to really focus on the content that has been developed by Olivia and John thus far on the draft EIS. And just wanted to share with you all, which I will send out after this meeting, a proposed comment letter outline for the draft One Seattle comprehensive plan. I will just want to remind everybody on the call and those listening in that we intend to approve both your letter on the draft EIS as well as your comment letter on the draft One Seattle comprehensive plan 4 weeks from today. As Michaela noted earlier in the meeting, we are dedicating all of our committee meetings and full commission meetings for the next 4 weeks on these two very important topics. And I thought it would be helpful to at least put out a proposed comment letter outline to you all and get some feedback. We don't have to get feedback in the next 4 minutes. You're more than welcome just to send me an email, but just for staff, for Olivia, John, and I to start fleshing out this outline so that we can move ahead with review. You all can review what we think we have heard from you all and flesh out a draft letter. Next slide, please. So again, open to comments, but and feedback, and very much would like to hear from you all. My proposal for the Planning Commission's letter outline on the draft One Seattle plan is to remind the readers of the overarching themes that we suggested 2 years ago from the issue briefs that you all developed on the growth strategy, need for affordable housing, need for anti-displacement, actionable strategies, and the need to think about repurposing the right of way. We determined last year that the commission would be reviewing the draft comp plan through a couple of different lenses. So across the elements that you all review, the lens of racial and social equity, climate, sustainable quality of life, anti-displacement, and housing access and choice. And then my thought was we could have a section of the letter that addresses overarching comments. This is not by any means an all-inclusive list, but some issues that I've heard from the commission thus far in your discussions over the last few weeks since the plan was released on March 5th. A need for data points to analyze the adequacy of the policies to achieve the desired outcomes, which are noted as goals in the plan. I've heard commissioners say that the goals are admirable and that you all would like additional data in order to really be able to analyze if the policies noted in the plan are going to get the city towards those admirable goals. There's also been a lot of talk about the necessary coordination between housing, land use, and transportation, necessary coordination and synergy, and then of course public health, how that shows up throughout the plan, as there is not a separate public health element. This again is not a definitive list, but I thought we could then go into comments that are specific to elements in the plan, the growth strategy, land use, transportation, housing, climate, and environment. Those are listed in the order that they appear in the plan, as I think it would be helpful for those reading your comment letter to be able to have the plan side by side with the Planning Commission's comment letter. I will note that the deadline for comments on the plan, draft plan, and draft EIS is May 6th. We do not have a full commission meeting scheduled after April 25th, the regularly scheduled Planning Commission meeting. I also do think that approving a letter on April 25th and having that letter public a week before the final comment period ends will be could be helpful for other individuals and groups reviewing the plan and providing comments. So I would like to highly suggest that we stick with that April 25th date to the extent possible. I see we are right at time, so we will talk about this again. I would really appreciate, please do not reply all in your emails to me, but would appreciate any initial thoughts you have in terms of the structure. Again, this outline is not content heavy. It really is more a skeleton to hang the more substantive comments that you all have on as staff starts developing this draft letter for approval in 4 weeks from now. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Michaela.
All right. Vanessa, that public comment that we received this morning, can you email that out to the commissioners?
I will do that. Yes,
okay, thank you. Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned. See you all next week. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, everyone.